It took 90 seconds, and it didn't look like the kind of fight people come to brag about afterward. The visiting karate champion had demanded something real, loudly enough that everyone in the room became a witness. When it ended, he was still on his feet, no dramatic fall, no shouting, yet the challenge had quietly collapsed. Bruce Lee didn't announce victory, he didn't explain what happened. Witnesses later agreed on one point: the room changed shape around his control. They said the room felt smaller that day, not because the space had changed, but because attention had. A modest training room will tolerate many things: noise, sweat, small injuries. But it doesn't tolerate uncertainty well. The mats were worn in the familiar places where feet had pivoted and dragged. A towel lay folded near the wall, placed as if it belonged there. Equipment sat in neat clusters, not arranged to impress anyone, simply kept where it would not interrupt the work. People arrived quietly. Some were students who knew the rhythm of the space, the unspoken rules about where to stand and when to speak. Others were visitors, drawn by reputation and curiosity. They stayed near the edges, hands loose at their sides, careful not to step onto the mat as if it were a stage. Even the ones who had come hoping to see something unusual behaved like guests. Bruce Lee was already moving when many entered. Not performing, moving. His warm-up was almost unremarkable unless you knew what to look for. The steps were small, efficient. His guard rested where it needed to rest without tightening into display. He repeated a short sequence, paused, adjusted his stance by an inch, repeated again. The work looked quiet enough to be mistaken for ordinary, but it had a precision that made the room feel organized around him. When he spoke, it was rarely for the whole room. A student would approach, and Bruce would answer in a low tone, sometimes with only a gesture. A hand indicating distance, a slight tap to correct alignment. A nod meaning again. He didn't inflate simple questions into lectures. He didn't turn the room toward philosophy. The focus stayed on what could be done, cleanly, without waste. Witnesses later remembered this part because it made the disruption feel sharper. The room had a calm order, and that order was not fragile. It was practical, built from repetition. You could feel it in the way people waited their turn, in the way nobody interrupted someone's movement just to talk. Then the door opened, and the atmosphere didn't explode, it tightened. A voice came in first, louder than the room required, a laugh placed where it didn't belong. Heads turned, not out of excitement, but out of reflex, the way people look when something enters that refuses to match the tone. A visiting karate champion stepped inside with the posture of someone used to being recognized. Taller than Bruce, broader through the shoulders, crisp in his bearing. He brought one or two companions who moved like witnesses rather than students. He looked across the room as if measuring it, and then his eyes settled on Bruce, as if the room's quiet work had suddenly become a question he intended to answer. The champion didn't begin with courtesy. Not exactly. He accepted greetings, nodded at introductions, allowed a student to gesture toward a place to set his things. But his attention kept drifting back to the center of the room, as if he was already imagining it rearranged around him. He spoke in a voice meant to carry, letting everyone hear the purpose of his visit without formally announcing it. He had heard stories, he said, about a man who didn't teach in the usual categories, who dismissed tradition when it got in the way, who spoke about efficiency as if it mattered more than lineage. The champion's tone made efficiency sound like a shortcut. He implied, lightly at first, that the reputation came from film and choreography, from camera angles that could make anything look sharp. A student tried to soften it. He offered what training rooms usually offer outsiders: a chance to work, to feel the timing, to compare methods without turning the room into a courtroom. Another suggested a controlled exchange, a demonstration. The champion smiled at those suggestions as if they were polite ways of avoiding the real issue. Then he said what he'd come to say. He wanted a real fight, not sparring, not light contact, not a lesson. He wanted something he could describe later without anyone dismissing it as cooperative. The word real landed in the room and stayed there. People along the wall stopped shifting their weight and became still. Even those who disliked confrontation understood what was happening. The champion wasn't asking to learn. He was asking to test authority in public. Bruce didn't respond immediately. He watched the man the way someone watches a movement before deciding how to answer it. Not with anger, not with amusement, with attention. Witnesses later said Bruce looked less like a man being challenged, and more like a man deciding whether the room could absorb this without becoming something else. The champion kept talking, as if his words could force the room to take his side. He spoke about karate titles, about proven champions, about what works when there is no cooperation. He positioned himself as the standard and Bruce as the question mark. Bruce finally spoke, but it wasn't a rebuttal. It was quiet, almost administrative, an attempt to reduce the situation to its simplest truth. "What do you want to prove?" The champion answered too quickly, as if he'd rehearsed it. He wanted to prove his karate could not be denied. He wanted to prove that Bruce's approach was untested, that it belonged to stories rather than to combat. Bruce nodded once. Not agreement with the aggression, acknowledgement of the moment. He did not raise his voice. He did not invite drama, but he also did not let the room drift into uncertainty. Witnesses remembered that he accepted the challenge without accepting the champion's terms of spectacle. It was a subtle difference, and it mattered. Once Bruce agreed to a test, the room reorganized itself without anyone giving instructions. People stepped back from the mat in small, cautious movements, creating a cleared space that felt both necessary and unwanted. The perimeter tightened into a semicircle. Not a cheering crowd, more like a jury that hadn't asked to be seated. Someone suggested rules again: gloves, light contact, a clear stop signal. The kind of boundaries that keep pride from becoming injury. The champion resisted each suggestion with the same impatience. He spoke as if rules were a way to dilute truth, as if control was the enemy of reality. His companions watched closely, eyes moving between Bruce and the onlookers, gauging the room like men collecting material for a story. The champion warmed up conspicuously. He rolled his shoulders, shook his arms, took a stance that announced experience. He wanted his body to speak before anything happened. He angled himself so that the onlookers could see his posture clearly, as if he were already writing the final memory in their minds. Bruce stepped onto the mat without changing expression. Witnesses noticed how little he prepared in visible ways. No pacing, no dramatic breathing, no tightening into performance. His posture stayed low and balanced, hands relaxed, shoulders quiet. The calm wasn't passive, it was placed carefully, like a weight that doesn't need to move to be felt. The champion interpreted that calm as disrespect. He stepped closer than necessary, invading personal space. He spoke again, now quieter but sharper, trying to force a reaction that would justify escalation. A few students shifted instinctively, not rushing forward but repositioning themselves as if they were ready to intervene if the room tipped too far. Bruce adjusted his stance by a fraction. To an untrained eye, it could have looked like nothing: an inch of angle, a subtle shift of weight. But those who trained recognized it as preparation without announcement. He didn't square up in a way that promised a brawl. He placed himself in a way that denied the champion a clean line. For a moment, the tension was almost purely psychological. The champion had brought noise and certainty into the room. Bruce answered with silence and structure. The champion kept checking the audience with his eyes, feeding off their attention. Bruce didn't check the audience at all. He watched only what mattered: distance, timing, commitment. Witnesses later described the room as holding its breath. Not because they expected violence, but because they sensed inevitability. A public challenge has a gravity to it. Once it exists, it pulls everyone into its orbit, even those who want no part of it. The question was no longer whether something would happen. It was what kind of thing it would become. The champion wanted a fight he could narrate. Bruce seemed willing to give him something else, something quieter, harder to argue with. The silence deepened, and the champion, perhaps sensing that he was losing control of the moment, leaned forward as if to start the only way he knew, by forcing the first collision. There was no clear signal to begin. No bell, no bow, no agreed start. 1 second the champion's body was still arranged for performance, and the next he committed to an action meant to establish dominance. Accounts differ on the exact motion. Some remembered a forward strike, others a shove, others a hard step-in meant to impose size. But every witness agreed on the intention. He moved as if the room belonged to him now. Bruce did not meet him head-on. He moved as if he had stepped aside from something predictable. The shift was minimal, almost dismissive in its economy, yet it changed the geometry of the exchange. The champion's effort met space where it expected resistance, and in that brief absence, his balance became negotiable. What happened next was difficult for people to describe later without sounding uncertain, not because it was mystical, but because it was too compact. Bruce's hands moved with a kind of quiet speed that didn't call attention to itself. There was no theatrical wind-up, no dramatic swing. The contact, if contact is even the right word, looked like interruption rather than attack. Some remembered the champion's arm being redirected. Some remembered a short strike to the body that seemed to turn the champion's breath inward. Others described a small foot action, nothing like a sweeping throw, more like a subtle removal of the support the champion assumed he had. The details shifted between storytellers, but the result remained consistent. The champion stopped talking. He was still upright. That detail mattered. There was no spectacle of a man being flattened. Instead, there was something more unsettling, a visible change in confidence. The champion's face tightened, then loosened, as if he had lost the ability to predict what came next. He looked down briefly, an involuntary check, like someone verifying that his legs were still receiving instructions. Bruce didn't chase him. He didn't punish the mistake. He stayed close enough to control distance and far enough to keep it from looking like a brawl. The calm was almost clinical. Witnesses later said it felt like watching someone close a door rather than slam it. The champion tried again. Pride insisted on a second attempt, perhaps to prove the first exchange had been an accident. But again, Bruce answered with the smallest necessary response, denying angles, interrupting rhythm, refusing to be pulled into a contest of force. Someone later measured the time, not with a stopwatch in the moment, but by reconstructing it. From the first committed action to the point where the champion's body language changed completely. 90 seconds, give or take, not long enough for fatigue to explain it, not long enough for a story of endurance, long enough only for a lesson in control. When Bruce finally stepped back, it did not feel like retreat. It felt like completion. He lowered his hands slightly, posture unchanged, and allowed the space to open again. The champion stood there, breathing differently now, as if the room had quietly revoked his authority. No one cheered. The silence that followed was not shock in the theatrical sense. It was recognition, slow, sober, and difficult to translate into words. The champion did not collapse to the floor, and in some ways that made it worse for him. A knockout can be blamed on a moment of bad luck, a slip, an exchange that went wrong. Remaining upright leaves fewer excuses. You are present for your own loss of certainty. He tried to speak as if words could restore the shape of the situation. A sentence started and thinned out. His voice did not carry the way it had when he entered. The crowd he had tried to recruit offered him nothing. No laughter, no outrage, no support. Their faces held an uncomfortable neutrality, the kind that appears when people realize they have witnessed something that cannot be spun easily. One witness later said the champion looked like a man searching for a familiar script and finding none. He had demanded a real fight and had received something real in a different way. Not brutality, not humiliation, but control that made his aggression seem unnecessary and, in hindsight, childish. Bruce did not deliver a speech. That absence became part of the lesson. He didn't explain Jeet Kune Do. He didn't claim superiority. He didn't point out the champion's errors with a teacher's pride. He simply allowed the outcome to stand on its own, as if adding words would weaken it. A student moved slightly, as though to check whether everyone was all right. Bruce acknowledged him with a small nod, the gesture of someone returning the room to order. That nod did more than any announcement could have done. It told the room that the moment was over, that the mat was not a stage, that training would continue. The champion's companions shifted uneasily. They avoided eye contact with the students along the wall, as if looking directly at them would confirm who now owned the story. The champion himself took a half step back, then another. Not fleeing, not dramatic, simply retreating from a space that no longer belonged to his performance. Witnesses remembered his hand touching his side briefly, not as if he were badly hurt, but as if he were verifying the reality of what he had felt. A disruption that didn't leave a visible mark, yet had ended the confrontation completely. There is a particular kind of embarrassment that comes from being neutralized without being damaged. It leaves pride nowhere to hide. The champion had come expecting to test Bruce's legitimacy. Instead, the room watched him fail to impose his terms. The loss was not physical alone. It was social, psychological. The room had seen him demand spectacle and then watch the spectacle refuse to appear. Bruce turned away first, not dismissively, decisively. He returned to a stance adjustment with a student, as if the main event had never been the challenger. The main event was always the work. That return to practice, to quiet instruction, was what many witnesses carried with them. It suggested that mastery isn't the moment you win. It's the moment you stop needing the room to know you have. In the days afterward, the story traveled the way honest stories do, carefully. It wasn't shouted across rooms. It was passed between people who trusted each other's judgment, often in quieter conversations, often with a kind of restraint that made it sound more believable. Those who told it rarely embellished. They didn't need to. The power of the incident was its simplicity. A visiting karate champion came in demanding a real fight. 90 seconds later, he left without having won the room. Some accounts said the champion tried to prevent the story from spreading. Not through threats, through silence. He did not return, his companions did not return. In some circles, the incident became a vague rumor, softened into something less sharp. A misunderstanding, a rough spar, a clash of styles. But in the room where it happened, witnesses remembered the texture of it too clearly to let it become comforting. They remembered the absence of celebration. They remembered how no one rushed to explain. They remembered how the room felt more like a classroom afterward than a battlefield. They remembered Bruce's face, unchanged, unperformative, as if the challenge had been a brief disruption rather than an identity-defining victory. Years later, when people asked about it, the details varied, but the lesson remained intact because it wasn't delivered as a moral. It was embedded in what Bruce did and did not do. He did not accept the champion's need for drama. He did not humiliate him further. He did not posture for the witnesses. He ended the challenge at the point where it was no longer necessary to continue. Some students would later say the incident influenced how they understood training spaces. A gym can become a theater in a single moment if someone arrives hungry for validation. Returning it to a place of work requires a different kind of authority, an authority that doesn't rise to meet noise but contains it. That is why the story lasted. Not because it was a violent triumph, but because it showed something rare. A man refusing to let a public challenge define him, even while answering it completely. Older witnesses, when telling it years later, often paused at the same place. They spoke about the 90 seconds, then went quiet before describing what happened after, the way Bruce turned away, the way the room exhaled, the way the champion's voice failed him. They didn't pause for effect. They paused because that was where language stopped being useful. The event became part of the larger legend not as a trophy, but as a reference point. A reminder that real skill can look like almost nothing from the outside. A reminder that force is not the same as control. A reminder that the most enduring victories are the ones that leave the least noise behind. And if there was a final detail people carried longest, it was this. The room returned to training quickly. Mats were straightened, stances were corrected, the ordinary work resumed, as if the lesson had never needed to be announced, only witnessed.